Jessica Harper, a woman accustomed to the power she wielded, had always been in control of people, situations, and environments. She was a force that couldn't be ignored, and the world had learned to bend to her will. At 35, with perfectly manicured nails and an outfit that screamed luxury, she stepped out of her sleek black limousine in front of Buckingham Palace. The sun hung low, scorching the city in its golden haze, but none of it bothered her. Jessica had a plan. The crowds gathered around, snapping pictures, their voices creating a dull hum in the air. Tourists, with their water bottles and wide-brimmed hats, were focused on the guards who stood like statues in front of the gates, immovable and resolute. For most, the royal guards were a spectacle, a symbol of tradition and unflinching discipline. But for Jessica, they were simply a backdrop, a prop in the grand stage she had set for herself. Her eyes zeroed in on one particular guard, his stoic face hidden beneath the towering black bearskin hat. He was tall, military posture perfect, and completely unaware of the storm that was about to break in his unshakable world. The crowd around her continued to click cameras and gossip, but Jessica was laser-focused. She wasn't here to admire the precision of the guards. No, she was here to challenge it. The idea hit her like a spark. What if I make him react? What if I make him kneel? With a smirk tugging at her lips, Jessica sauntered forward, her heels clicking against the cobblestones like a ticking clock, each step loud, deliberate. She stopped just inches from the guard, her sharp eyes scanning him, as if sizing him up, like an object to be conquered. Her lips curled into a mocking smile. The crowd's chatter began to dim as they noticed her. They were watching now, waiting for her to do something. "Hey, you still alive in there?" she taunted, snapping her fingers in front of his face. Nothing. Not a flicker, not a twitch. The guard stood as still as a stone statue, his gaze fixed forward, undisturbed by the chaos around him. The crowd gasped, some chuckling, others in awe of Jessica's audacity. Her fingers itched with impatience. She leaned in closer, her voice dripping with disdain. "Do you even know who I am?" she hissed, her breath barely a whisper against his ear. The crowd was rapt, cameras zoomed in on her every move. But the guard remained silent, unbothered. Jessica's jaw tightened. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to being ignored. In that moment, her frustration boiled over. She reached out and shoved him with all her strength. The crowd sucked in a collective breath, the moment hanging in the air, thick with tension. The guard didn't move, not even a stumble. But he had reacted, if only just. Jessica's heart raced, adrenaline pumping through her veins. The game had begun. But in the back of her mind, a creeping feeling gnawed at her, a feeling that this time, just maybe, she had pushed the wrong button. The moment Jessica shoved the royal guard, something in the air shifted. The crowd held its breath, the sound of her heels clicking against the pavement still echoing in the stillness. She had expected him to flinch, to show some sign of human weakness. But he didn't. His stone-cold expression remained unchanged, his posture as rigid as before. The guard's stoicism only fed her growing anger, but this was not the time to back down. Jessica was accustomed to getting what she wanted. Men, employees, strangers, they all cowered before her, bowing to her whims. With a flick of her wrist, they would fall in line, submitting to her authority. She wasn't used to resistance, not like this. And now, standing before this immovable figure, her irritation turned into something far darker. Her sense of control was slipping away, and she didn't like it. She took a step back, eyes narrowing as she steadied the guard. His silence was almost mocking. How dare he? She thought. How dare he ignore me like I'm nothing? Her breath quickened, her fingers twitching with the need to make him react. The cameras from the surrounding tourists continued to capture her every move. Jessica was the center of attention now, and she felt the familiar surge of power coursing through her. But the guard, the one person she needed to submit, still stood unmoving. The audience was waiting for something to happen. They were hungry for spectacle. For a moment, she paused, her lips curling into a smirk. It was time to escalate. Without hesitation, she stepped closer, her high heels clicking menacingly against the stone pavement. She leaned in, her face inches from his, her voice dripping with disdain. "Do you even know who I am?" she hissed, her breath hot against his unmoving face. "I've made men fall to their knees before me. What makes you think you'll be any different?" The crowd shifted, whispers rippling through the onlookers. Some gasped in disbelief, while others recorded every second of this unusual encounter. Jessica's heart raced with excitement. This is it, she thought. I'm going to break him. I will make him kneel. Her eyes glinted with a mix of amusement and cruelty. But the guard remained still. Not a single muscle twitched. Not even a blink. He was like a living statue, untouchable, unshakable. A deep sense of frustration welled up inside her. Her mouth pressed into a tight line. She wasn't accustomed to being ignored, to having her authority challenged. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. Her gaze darkened. If he won't kneel voluntarily, she thought, then I'll make him. With a sudden, vicious motion, she shoved him again, this time harder. Her hand connected with the thick fabric of his uniform, and she pushed with all her strength, her body straining with the effort. The crowd gasped. Someone shouted in surprise. For a split second, she felt the slightest give, a shift in his posture. The guard staggered back, just an inch. But it was enough. Jessica's breath hitched in victory. She had done it. She had made him move. The thought sent a thrill through her chest, but it was fleeting. She was so close now. This is it, she thought, I've got him. But the guard didn't fall. He didn't crumble. Instead, he straightened, his eyes never leaving her. His silence was a wall that no force she could muster would ever breach. The tension in the air thickened, like the stillness before a storm. Jessica's pulse quickened. She wasn't used to backing down, to losing control. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. Why won't you fall? She thought, desperate now. She grabbed his shoulders, her manicured nails sinking into the fabric of his uniform. With a grunt, she pressed down, trying to force him into a kneeling position. The guard's body didn't budge. The muscles in her arms screamed from the effort, but no matter how hard she pushed, he remained solid, like a mountain unyielding to the wind. The crowd around her murmured, the tension mounting. Some were laughing, others were staring, unsure of what was happening. But Jessica didn't care. She was in the zone now, determined to make him submit. She didn't care who was watching, she would have her victory. But the guard remained indifferent, unshaken. His silence was louder than any protest. The longer he stood there, the more it gnawed at her. Was he human? Or was he simply an extension of this rigid institution that refused to bend? Jessica's pulse thudded in her ears, the rush of adrenaline making her hands shake as she pushed harder against the royal guard. Her nails dug into his uniform, her muscles straining with the effort to make him yield. She was so close, so close. This was supposed to be her moment, the moment she proved to everyone around her that she was untouchable. But no matter how much force she applied, the man before her remained unmoved. He was a wall, impervious to her touch, his silence now a taunt she couldn't escape. The crowd around her had gone quiet, but their eyes were still glued to the spectacle unfolding before them. Some were recording, some were whispering, others just stood frozen in disbelief. Jessica could feel them watching, their eyes locked on her as if waiting for the inevitable fall. The expectation in the air was palpable, and yet, with each second that passed, Jessica's frustration mounted. She had always been able to control every situation. Every person she encountered knew who she was, knew what she could do. She had bent reality to her will for years, and it had never been this hard. But here, now, in front of Buckingham Palace, it was as if the very laws of power had shifted. The more she pushed, the more she realized something was wrong. Why isn't he moving? She thought desperately. Why doesn't he flinch? A chill ran down her spine. She stepped back, breathing heavily, her eyes darting over the man in front of her, trying to find a crack, a moment of vulnerability. But there was nothing. His eyes were fixed forward, his body solid like a statue, and for the first time, Jessica felt a sliver of doubt creep into her thoughts. What if I've made a mistake? Her mind raced, but the guard didn't give her time to process it. The stillness between them was broken by a single, terrifying word, a voice like thunder. Stand down. Jessica froze, her breath catching in her throat. There was something in that voice, something commanding, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It wasn't just a warning. It was an order. The crowd around her shifted uncomfortably, sensing the change in the atmosphere. People who had been laughing, some even egging her on, now stepped back, their expressions faltering. There was no laughter now, just fear, an undercurrent of dread. Jessica's heart raced, and for the first time in a long while, she felt it. Fear. Genuine fear. She tried to speak, to dismiss the command as some trick, but the word stuck in her throat. It wasn't the reaction she was used to. Her hands trembled, her perfect, manicured nails now betraying her as they clutched at the air for something, anything, to grasp onto. Before she could even gather her thoughts, the ground beneath her seemed to tremble. The echo of heavy footsteps filled the space around her, slow and deliberate, like the pounding of a drum. Jessica's gaze snapped to the gates of Buckingham Palace, and what she saw made her blood run cold. From the gates, 6 more guards appeared, their uniforms gleaming in the sunlight, moving with perfect synchronization. They weren't just standing there anymore, now they were advancing, their eyes locked onto her. A sudden wave of panic washed over Jessica. She spun around, desperate for a way out, but the crowd had already begun to back away, parting like the sea before a storm. She could feel their fear now, see it in their eyes. They weren't watching a show anymore. They were watching something real, something that no one had anticipated. One of the new guards, larger and more imposing than the others, took a step forward. His eyes never left Jessica. She felt a tremor in her chest as he slowly raised his helmet, revealing the face beneath it. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She blinked, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. The man who stood before her was none other than the king himself. Her knees buckled beneath her. The air seemed to evaporate from her lungs, and a cold shiver crawled down her spine. The man she had tried to break, who had remained calm, unshaken, and unwavering, was the very embodiment of power she had always sought to control. And now, standing in front of her, his eyes fixed with an unnerving calm, was the ruler of the United Kingdom. She staggered back, her thoughts spinning. This can't be real. This must be some kind of joke. But the weight of the moment, the crushing reality of the situation, was undeniable. She could see the years of history, the lineage of power, etched into his face. His silence was deafening, and the power he exuded was far beyond anything Jessica had ever experienced. The king's voice sliced through the tension, calm but unyielding. "You wanted to break us," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Now you will learn what it means to kneel." Jessica's stomach dropped. The truth was beginning to sink in, and it was far worse than she ever could have imagined. She wasn't just facing a guard anymore. She wasn't even facing a man. She was facing the very institution she had so carelessly provoked, and in that moment, she realized something she could never have foreseen. She had crossed a line that she could never uncross. Jessica's heart pounded, each beat echoing in her ears as the king's piercing gaze seemed to freeze her in place. The world around her was a blur, her body refusing to move as the realization hit her with crushing force. "I've gone too far." Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. The crowd, once full of curiosity and laughter, was now watching in dead silence, their faces twisted with unease. Jessica's eyes darted from the king to the guards closing in behind her. Their synchronized steps were deliberate, and each movement seemed to carry the weight of destiny itself. She was trapped. There was no escape. The king didn't need to raise his voice to command attention, his presence alone did that. His expression remained calm, a chilling contrast to the panic spreading within Jessica. How did it come to this? She had been so certain, so convinced of her own power. And now, she was facing the very man she had unknowingly provoked. His silence was deafening, and in that silence, Jessica felt her control slip further away. "Run," a voice in her head screamed, but her legs felt like lead. The ground beneath her seemed to tilt, and she could feel the cold sweat dripping down her spine. She wasn't the one in charge anymore. The people who had once admired her were now stepping away, eyes averted, as though avoiding the stain of her disgrace. The world was closing in around her, and she was powerless to stop it. The king's eyes never wavered as he stepped closer, his movements precise and unhurried. Every step he took sent a ripple of fear through her chest. He was close now, too close, and the air between them felt heavy, oppressive. She could smell the faint scent of his cologne, sharp and distinct against the backdrop of the palace's cold stone. His gaze didn't falter for a second, and Jessica's insides twisted. "You made a mistake." The king's voice broke the tension, low but final, carrying an edge of inevitability. "Now you will learn what it means to cross the line." Jessica's legs shook, but her pride held her in place, even if it was the only thing keeping her from crumbling. She opened her mouth, wanting to speak, to make excuses, but the words caught in her throat. "This isn't happening," she thought frantically. "This isn't real." But it was real. Every bit of it. The coldness in the king's voice, the heaviness of his presence, the guards now closing in on all sides, every inch of the situation screamed reality. Jessica's mind raced, searching for a way out. She had always controlled every situation she was in, bending people to her will, dominating every room. But this was something else entirely. The king stepped forward again, this time so close that Jessica could feel the heat from his body. His voice came again, and this time, it was the final blow. "You're part of the game now." His words weren't a threat, not a warning, they were a decree. Jessica's breath caught in her throat, and for the first time in her life, she felt utterly powerless. She had never been the prey. She had always been the hunter, the one who dictated the rules, who held the reins of every situation. But here, in this moment, surrounded by these royal figures who moved like an unstoppable force, she was nothing more than a pawn. And she was learning the hard way that the game she had played for so long had rules she had never understood. A sharp, metallic sound rang out as the guards shifted into position, their rifles now aimed at the ground, but their presence spoke louder than any weapon. The message was clear. There was no more room for defiance. There was no going back. The king gave a slight nod, and the air seemed to crackle with an unseen force. Jessica could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She had crossed a line, and now, the consequences were about to unfold. Her legs finally gave out, and she stumbled back, only to be caught by the guards. Her world spun, and as she was led toward the palace doors, the realization hit her like a freight train. Her life was no longer in her hands. She had provoked a power that had no mercy, and now she would learn exactly what it meant to kneel. Jessica stumbled, her heels scraping against the cobblestones, as the weight of her defeat crashed down on her like a tidal wave. The king's words echoed in her mind, reverberating through her entire being. "You're part of the game now." The realization that she had crossed a point of no return sank deeper with every step she took toward the palace gates. The crowd, which had once hung on her every move, now stood frozen, their eyes filled with a mix of disbelief and something darker, fear. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat like a countdown to an inevitable fate. She could feel the eyes of the royal guards on her, their presence suffocating, their rifles still pointed downward in perfect synchrony, yet their silent threat was palpable. The guards' every movement seemed deliberate, calculated, a reminder that she was no longer in control. "I've made a mistake," she thought, but it was too late for regret. The king's face, as calm and impenetrable as stone, seemed to loom over her, haunting her thoughts. The reality of the situation was becoming clearer with every step she took toward the palace. There was no escape. The path ahead was blocked by more royal guards, moving like shadows, silently closing in on her from every angle. She had no idea where to go, no plan, no strategy to rely on. All the certainty that had once defined her was gone, replaced by a sinking dread that clawed at her chest. Her movements slowed, her confidence faltering with each passing second. The king was watching her, observing her every reaction with an unnerving calm. Why isn't he saying anything? She wanted to scream, to plead, but her throat felt tight, as if the very air had been sucked from her lungs. The doors to the palace creaked open slowly, almost mockingly, as though beckoning her forward. But she was trapped. The guards had already moved into position, their faces stoic, their eyes devoid of mercy. There was nowhere left to run, no more room for defiance. She had pushed too far. Jessica's mind raced, but every thought felt like it was slipping through her fingers like sand. The king stepped closer, his gaze unflinching, his voice like ice. "You wanted to make someone kneel," he said, his words carrying the weight of a verdict. "Now, you will kneel, Jessica. But not by force. You will kneel before the consequences of your own actions." Jessica's breath hitched in her chest. She had never imagined this moment, never thought she would be the one forced into submission. She had always been the one with power, the one who commanded, who controlled. Now, she was on the edge of a precipice, staring into the abyss of her own humiliation. Her knees trembled, not from weakness, but from a deep, gnawing fear that she could not suppress. This wasn't supposed to happen. The thought repeated over and over in her head, but it offered no comfort, no escape. The king's words were like chains wrapping around her, tighter and tighter with every breath she took. The guards remained still, unwavering in their silent watch, but their presence was a constant reminder of her defeat. "Do you understand now?" the king asked, his voice still steady, still unyielding. Jessica opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Her pride, her arrogance, had been shattered in an instant. She had once thought herself untouchable, above the consequences of her actions, but now she saw the truth in the king's eyes. No one is above the law. No one is beyond reach. Her eyes filled with a mix of anger and disbelief, but she knew deep down that resistance was futile. She was no longer the one in control. The king had orchestrated every move, every response. Her bravado had been no match for his power, and now she would pay the price. As she stood there, facing the looming palace gates, Jessica realized that this was not the end. It was the beginning of something far worse than anything she could have imagined. The king had shown her mercy, but mercy had its own price. She had entered the game thinking she could manipulate the rules. But now, the game had turned against her, and she would soon learn what it meant to play with fire. The consequences were coming, and they were not kind. Hello, dear viewers. What a thrilling and unexpected journey we've just witnessed, right? Jessica, once confident and arrogant, has now found herself in a situation she can no longer control. She's paid a heavy price, and now she must face the consequences of her actions. Will Jessica rise and find a way out, or will she crumble under the weight of her fate? What do you think of Jessica's decisions? Do you believe she can turn the tide, or is it already too late? Were her actions throughout the story more infuriating or sympathetic? If you were in her shoes, what advice would you give her right now? We want to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and share your opinions about Jessica and her journey. What do you think she should do next? Is there still a chance for redemption, or is it all too late? Join the discussion with us and help us explore the next chapter of Jessica's story. The story is far from over, and your feedback could shape what happens next. We're eager to hear your insights, questions, or suggestions. Let's dive in and continue this adventure together.